Hey everybody, Brian from Necronomicast here. The music you hear in the background is from Coyote Chris Sutton. He was a musician, author, storyteller, presenter, show host. Coyote Chris was well known in the paranormal community, and he lost his battle with cancer last month. He was scheduled to be a guest on this program for 2022, and unfortunately, things aren't going to work out that way. But I just wanted to dedicate the October programming of this show to the memory of Coyote Chris. He was known for bringing light to the darkest places. Rest in peace, Coyote Chris. And now, on with our October programming on the Necronomicast. From the haunted Heartland in Omaha, Nebraska, my name is Brian Corey, and it is my pleasure to welcome you one and all, young and old, to this episode of the Necronomicast. As I continue my special October programming, highlighting the stories and unique voices of the haunted Heartland here in Nebraska and Iowa and the Midwest, it's my pleasure to bring not one, but two distinguished authors for your listening pleasure. First up is Boye. Later, Tayden Bundy, and they've both written incredible books about the paranormal and the true ghost stories of Nebraska. Whether you're from Los Angeles, California, New York, Paris, France, or Paris, Texas, you're going to enjoy listening to these masterful writers tell you about the ghosts of Lincoln, Nebraska. And now calling in on the Necronomicast hotline, author Boye. Alan, how are you?
I'm just great, Brian. Thanks.
I am super excited to have you on this show. When I was growing up, there was an important book that guys my age that liked the paranormal, that liked ghost stories, there was an important book that we had to get, and it had an iconic yellow cover. And you are the author of that book, A Guide to the Ghosts of Lincoln. And I have the second edition right here.
Let's see which one you have. Oh, yeah. Okay.
It was iconic with this yellow cover and this hand-drawn cover, I suppose. And then I also have a copy.
We could talk about that cover in a moment, but keep going.
And then recently, when I made contact with you again, I was kind of perusing through different books and everything online. I saw that there was this Guide to the Ghosts of Lincoln, the new edition. So
yeah, exciting.
Yeah. Welcome to the show. How you been?
Thank you. It's funny that you would show that particular yellow cover. It had a yellow cover for ages. It first came out in 1983. It's still in print, pushing 40 years later. I often tell people that my tombstone's going to read, "He wrote that ghost book."
Well, like I said, it was really important to guys my age. Now I'm 41. So in 1983, I was 9 years old, maybe 8, depending on what time of year it came out. So 8 or 9 years old. I just remember going to the bookstores, like we'd go to Husker games and we'd go to the mall and we'd go to different places while we waited for the game to start. And I remember seeing in the fall, they would always have the display out with the Ghosts of Lincoln, Boye.
Sure.
So I've got this. Sure. I have a really nice, clean copy of the second edition, but the first edition came out in 83, 84. Is that what you said?
I thought I'd show you the cover of this one. This is the very first edition.
Nice.
And it was stapled and very thin. But this cover, I fancied. Well, I shouldn't say that. I drew the cover myself, and I'm not proud of it, but I wanted to point something out because, Brian, you'll be the first person ever to hear this story.
Awesome.
But this first edition, the figure shown in the window is the silhouette from Bruce Springsteen's album, Nebraska.
So you just traced it and put it on the cover?
Yeah. And I put it as the figure in there. And the idea was subliminally, because that album had just come out when this book came out, subliminally people would say, "Oh, yeah, I got to get that." And then your cover, this one that you just showed, which was a later edition, was done by the artist Jim Exton, who is a really wonderful illustrator and has that kind of gothic look to it. But I finally had to give up the yellow cover because this version, which came out, I think, in the early 2000s, this cover is by a wonderful Nebraska artist by the name of Shelley Thornton. And Shelley, a lot of people know her. She is noted for the fact that she makes art dolls from scratch that are just like a beautiful, beautiful work anyway. And then finally, or I shouldn't say finally, but the current edition, which is a cover by Tora Horn, also a Nebraska photographer. So there's the whole history in covers.
All right. I love it. I love all the different editions. I don't think I've ever seen, I've always looked on eBay for a first edition of the book just to have for my own collection, but I didn't know it was like stapled and folded like that.
Yeah, it's sold quite a bit. They're out there. One time not that I ever would Google it, but one time I saw that a first edition was going for like $90. I thought, really? I got a whole closet full.
Oh, wow. Well, maybe you can part with one of those by the end of this conversation or not. So at the beginning of the conversation, before I hit the record button, you were saying that you're happily retired. What are you happily retired from?
Well, I'm happily retired from a wonderful job at a college in Vermont. I taught English and writing and stuff like that, literature, for the past, 30 years. So, yeah.
So, but are you from Nebraska, Lincoln, Nebraska?
I grew up in Lincoln. My undergraduate degree is from the University of Nebraska. I have relatives in Lincoln and spend a fair time in Nebraska.
To this day?
To this day, yeah.
Very good, very good. Well, like I said, this was an important book for probably for a lot of people, but for a young man, 10 years old, 11 years old, whenever I got my first copy, it was a very important book for us because I read books about ghosts and I read books about Bigfoot, and I got a lot of those from like the school library or from the Omaha Public Library or the Scholastic Book Club when we'd order books. But this one was a book about ghosts from Lincoln, from Nebraska. Now, I'm an Omaha guy, but just right down the road is Lincoln. And so these were all ghosts of places that I've been to or that I was going to go to, or we took field trips to, like the state capitol building. What made you, back in the 80s, decide to write a book about paranormal activity in Lincoln, Nebraska?
Well, I grew up, as I said, in Lincoln, and I grew up in hearing stories. I think every kid hears ghost stories and legends and stuff like that. I heard ghost stories around my town. When I was a teenager, the C.C. White building, which is a wonderful ghost story, it's known internationally. The C.C. White building, you could go walk, the doors were always unlocked. You could go up midnight and walk into this building on the Wesleyan campus, which was supposedly haunted. So these stories were bubbling around my consciousness as folk stories, really. As we grow up in our towns, those who are lucky enough get to hear the stories in our neighborhoods. And so those just were in my head. I like to write, and so I put newspaper ads in high school newspapers, in the Lincoln papers, asking the ad said, "Have you seen a ghost? And if so, write Ellen Boye, blah, blah, blah." And I started to get not just dozens, but hundreds of stories from people who would say, I saw a ghost. So I had all these letters and sometimes phone calls in a big pile. I'd sort through them, and the stories that I picked for that first edition were either ones I knew a little bit about or that were so powerfully told and so believably told that I ended up sort of translating them and putting them in the book.
So you solicited like an ad out in the Lincoln Journal-Star and got all these stories. People just wrote into you, and I assume most of them were not anonymous. People just used their names and said,
"Oh, no."
Yeah. So
yeah.
Did you, So we're talking in the 80s here. And so this kind of predates a lot of television shows where people are going out ghost hunting and things like that. Did you go out did you go out and investigate any of these locations yourself?
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. As many as I could, actually. And I think the one at on 20th and Washington Street in Lincoln is a great story, because to this day I can walk through that intersection and kind of feel the chills. So part of the investigation, if you will, was to talk to the people whose story it was, who saw the ghost, who smelled the smells, who heard the noises in the ceiling and so forth, and started to judge not so much whether they're sincere or not, but just to try to get at what it is that they thought they saw. So that was always, still is, a fascinating part of doing the work on the ghost stories, which, by the way, keeps going on. The latest edition that the University of Nebraska Press published came out, I don't know, 5 or 8 years ago, and it's got newer stories in it. It's up to date, as it were. If you can call a ghost story up to date.
Right. Well, what's great about a ghost story, it's also, when told properly and investigated thoroughly, it's a historical story. It's the story of our history. There's a lot of stories about, in your books, the pioneer days, or people's first settling Lincoln. And you talk about how Lincoln was, people were building their homesteads and out on the prairie, and they can overlook in the far lights of the town, far away of Lincoln, far away. So there's great history that's unleashed when you write these stories and you research them and everything. You mentioned 20th and Washington. Is that the one where the gentleman was shot down at the intersection?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
That's a terrible story. And his sister lived for years in their house, and caretakers, she wouldn't go upstairs anymore. And she looked at the bed, and it looked like he had just left it. The bed was made and everything. Yeah. And then she turns for a second.
You remember this very well.
I told you I read this book.
Well, that caretaker was a hospice nurse,
right?
Who I interviewed. That story was in the first edition, actually, but the hospice nurse part of it came years later. So in a newer edition, I would update that story. So that's a good example how some stories keep vibrating. Whatever it is that people see or think they see, it seems to keep going into the future a lot of times, and hence a lot of these stories get updated.
How do you determine, or how are you getting stories? I know that the last edition came out a number of years ago, not that long ago, but are you getting them from the University of Nebraska Press? Are people still mailing them in, or how are you getting the stories?
Every once in a while, I'll get an email, I'll get a letter, I'll get a phone call, and I have a big file. I write down all the information, stick it in there, and then the next time I come to write a new edition, sometimes I'll interview the people right then and there as well. So if people see this and they've got a good ghost story, probably the best thing to do is contact me through the University of Nebraska Press. They can always find me. In any event, yeah. So throughout my writing career, I've had opportunities to sort of come across other ghost stories. I did a guidebook to the state of Nebraska, and in part of that research was coming across ghost stories. One really good place to find such stories is in your local town history books. Almost every town, if you dig deep enough, has an old history book. In the state of Nebraska, most of the counties have a county history, and a lot of those histories were written in the 40s. And you read those things, and in those histories, local history books, you find the greatest ghost stories. You find hints of UFOs, stuff that people don't know what they're seeing, but, Mildred over at so-and-so's farm claims that, and it's right there in this old town history.
The more and more I read all these stories and all these historical accounts of different things, not just around Nebraska, but just around the country and everything. So many of these things seem to be related too. Like you'll see the farm will have strange lights and things like that. And is it a spectral visitor, or could it be alien? Could it be UFO? Because a lot of the things that are associated with maybe a poltergeist activity, sometimes those are the same things that are part of a visitation by aliens in these stories.
Funny you should mention that, because I recalled earlier today a story in Lincoln that takes place at near one of the huge grain elevators on the western part of town. Mm-hmm. And I got a lot of stories about people having seen something at this one spot. And so I dug around a little bit, and it turns out that at that same spot in 1957, there was a claimed UFO sighting there. So in 1957, so I'm hearing ghost stories, but I do a little research and find out that, 50, 60 years ago, there was a UFO, or people claims they had seen a UFO at that same spot. So that, I'm not necessarily a full believer in ghosts, but I hear these stories, and boy, I get the chills down my spine, and I throw up my shoulders and say, I don't know what happened here.
Yeah, that's funny that you mentioned. One of my questions for you was going to be, have you ever seen a ghost?
Well, one of the stories in the book happened to me. I'll just put it that way.
Okay. And so, but you're not a full-blown believer.
I wouldn't say, I'd put it this way. I am the kind of person who absolutely believes that there are spirits out there in here. And those spirits are all sorts of different forms. And to some people, those spirits might be ghosts. To some people, they may be the ancestral, the elders of a community who still carry a wisdom of how things should be. Those are all, it may be walking out in the woods, a tree might have a spirit. So I'm absolutely a believer in spirits.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. When somebody says, well, Brian, do you believe in ghosts? I'm like, well, I don't even know what a ghost is. And we've had this discussion with other people on the show, that are you talking about a spirit of somebody that persists after bodily death? Are you talking about maybe something that's like a time loop? Or are you talking about who knows? A ghost could be a poltergeist. It could be a jinn. It could be on and on and on.
It could be mice in the wall.
Yeah, it could be. Well, yeah, it could be mice on the wall. Most paranormal events are just perceived to be paranormal, and there's a total logical explanation for something that makes your imagination go haywire. I have to compliment you. I was reading, I reread like your introduction to the book, and the introduction reads like a modern day paranormal study. And what I mean by that is that there's all these theories that are coming out now about, a ghost could be, like I said, something that's a spirit that lives on past bodily death. But also you start to talk about how things can be shifts in time and things like that. That seems real cutting edge for 1984, or maybe not. Maybe I just need to do more research. What things did you read to kind of get a paranormal sense?
Well, for one thing, I read a lot of history. It's going to sound kind of odd, but I read a lot of history, and that includes some really obscure history. And in those books, and as well as in literature, you can find all sorts of hints at the paranormal. You have people like Edgar Allan Poe writing, some of the first ghost stories. You've got Nathaniel Hawthorne having a character walk through the woods and seeing all his townspeople appear in the wilderness to him. And all these are they're kind of ghost stories. They're kind of stories about seeing an apparition or seeing a spirit that we can't figure out how come that person is here. How come those images are in front of me? And so for me, it was a matter of, I had a journalism background. So for me, it was a matter of doing some research into ghosts. In part, it was to recall those wonderful works of literature, even from people such as Lincoln, Nebraska's own Loren Eiseley. And if your viewers have not discovered Loren Eiseley, he's such a marvelous writer. He has a story growing up in Lincoln where he's traveling through the wastewater tunnels around Lake Street Lake in the 19 teens and seeing things. so history itself tells us, informs us of the nature of things we can't explain.
You received hundreds of stories from your solicitation in the newspaper. How did you read through them and decide what made the cut?
It was kind of thank you for the question. It was a kind of gut feeling. It was in part, some of them I'd already heard of. And so here somebody that claims they saw that one or whatever it might have been. So, and then sometimes I would call the people and you kind of talk to them and you think, well, maybe this person is not the one I want to use in the book because it's something about how they talk to me. But I also have, I'll do book signings and author talks and stuff, and people will walk up to me and say, hey, in one occasion, I had a father come up with a 9-year-old kid, said, tell him what you saw. And, the kid tells me, and the kid's, for all practical purposes, I'm convinced that kid knows what he's talking about or saw what he thinks he saw. So those are kind of things that kind of go into the equation of whether or not I think the story is valid enough to retell it.
Yeah. And the way that you retell them, though, you're a very, very, very talented writer. And so to take these stories and these interviews that you've done and to put them not only in it's befitting of a ghost book. I mean, you write with a lot of, mystery in there. You leave some to the imagination. You lead people down kind of a path. So I got to hand it to you. I mean, as a boy reading this book, and then as a teenager reading this book, and then as a young man, now an adult reading this book again, it was very formative in my early years of finding things of interest in the paranormal. There's another.
That's great, Brian. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. There's another story in here. The disappearance. It's not necessarily a ghost story, but very strange nonetheless. And it's a very sad tale. The disappearance of Charles Danka.
Danka, yeah.
Yeah, that's very strange. And so a little bit of that story, a young man a long time ago in the early days of Lincoln meets a beautiful woman in Germany. They settle down. She doesn't like Lincoln, Nebraska. She'd rather be married to a baron in Germany. Tragedy falls upon them. They lose children to illness. She leaves him, and then he kind of has a very sad, lonely existence. And then who knows what happened? How did you investigate that, or what led you down to include like a strange disappearance in a ghost book?
It's the same thing we've been talking about today, Brian. It's human beings want to understand the world that they've been thrust into. We want to understand reality. And it turns out, in my opinion, that a lot of the reality that we experience is all up here. I mean, I'm hearing your voice in a certain way that's coming in here that's different from the way anyone else hears it. I'm looking out my windows of my house and I'm seeing trees in the way Alan Boye sees trees. So to try to understand how we human beings make sense of this world that we've been thrust into sometimes involves simply presenting the mystery itself. And that particular story, as I recall, was exactly that for me. It presented the mystery, not, oh, and I saw a ghost, or, oh, and this happened. But here is a story of tragedy that, in a sense, we all face our own demise. And to understand how that reality impacts our life is what leads me to a lot of these stories. Interesting,
because it's a very sad tale, and so many stories that are ghost stories. There's not a lot of happy ghost stories. There's not a lot of stories about, oh, the ghost helped me find my car keys, or the ghost led me to buried treasure. There's stories about love lost, or unrequited love, or tragedy, like the story of the young woman that fell to her death, supposedly from suicide, at the University of Nebraska dorms. there's a sense of like reading the story, how you wrote it, how she was very alone. She had her books and her studies and her poetry, but there was something missing. And that something missing, maybe that's what in the spirit world, somebody's looking for, persisting after death. And so
very well said.
I had a story, sort of. It's not me. A friend of the program.
Wait, let me get my pen.
Yeah, right. Maybe you've heard about this one and it's in a file someplace. But a friend of mine and he was on the show. I interviewed him. He's a jazz musician, went to the university. He's a jazz musician of note in Denver, Colorado. So if Andrew is listening right now, hello, Andrew. And Andrew was on my episode number 150, and we were talking about haunted locations, and he was a guest for part of the program. And I remember when I first met Andrew, he was an incredible jazz saxophone player, but much more accomplished musician than I was. And when he asked if I wanted to hang out after a concert in his house for a couple drinks after a show, I was like, yeah, this is going to be really cool. I get to hang out with this cool guy. And Andrew starts telling me a story, not exaggerating, not being sensationalistic, just like, well, I think this place is haunted. And of course that piqued my interest. And I'm like, how so? Well, he tells me the story of he sees a young woman. He was like moving in and just kind of cleaning his apartment, no parties, nothing crazy going on. He was just in his room. And he sees all of a sudden a white figure, and it moves very gracefully down this hallway, and it goes through a wall. And he was just like, oh my gosh, what did I just see? And he wasn't scared. He just kind of took it all in. And this house was near 17th-ish area in Lincoln. And what was remarkable about this house, there were stained glass windows in this house that he was renting. It was kind of later in the history of the house, it was converted into multiple dwellings. So he was living
still
there.
Standing. Do you know if it's still standing?
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
In fact,
go on.
Okay.
Good.
So, and even in this house, a man that designed a lot of the stained glass windows in the state capitol, there's some of his stained glass was in this place, like winged buffaloes. So if that conjures up any information for you. So he was telling me about it while I was there, and I thought it was very strange. And the scariest part for him wasn't seeing this apparition. It was a couple weeks later, the landlord who owned the house lived out of state. And so they were just kind of talking about, things between a renter and a landlord, just business stuff. And at the end of the conversation, she goes, oh, by the way, have you seen the woman? And other people have seen it too, that he has since talked to. But that's when he first got like scared, because it confirmed what he had saw. And she's like, oh yeah, exactly. Have you seen the woman? And he's like, ooh. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't,
Yeah.
So sometimes these things are very, he wasn't in a crowded room and everybody saw it. Sometimes these things are very personal. Sometimes they're very intimate. And we don't know why we see them. You just kind of have to be in tune with the strangeness around you. Like we always say, there's no such thing as coincidence on this program. It's just things that we don't know. They happen for reasons we don't know why.
And may never, and humanity may never know why. You touch on a really good thing there, and that is that our stories, if they're confirmed by another, give us more ownership, give us more grounding in what we perceive as real. So when the landlady says, have you seen the woman yet? Which I get that kind of double. Well, one of the stories I tell in the book is in a house that's near a section of Lincoln called College View. And I first learned of this story a long time ago. Somebody told me about it, wrote it up, and then it turns out and it was in the book, and I'm meet a woman who starts to describe a ghost in her house, and I said, well, where's the house? And it's the same house that I heard about like 7 years earlier from different people. So I started digging in, and this woman had bought it from previous owners, and the one I first heard the story from was back here 2 owners ago. And this woman says, oh, yeah, well, the lady I bought it from said, don't be careful. It's a haunted house. And anyway, so the story gets kind of, mirrored in the same way you and your friend, in the same way your friend heard from the landlady that it was haunted.
Yeah. And how strange that, other people had seen her. And so he did a little bit of investigation and didn't come up with much, couldn't find a name or anything like that. And if you really kind of go down the rabbit hole of a haunting, are we seeing something that has some kind of some intelligence now, or is it like a time loop? Like we're seeing things from the past that are just kind of replaying in front of us. This woman that he saw was relatively young, but I had another conversation with a paranormal investigator and of some note. His name's John Tenney, and he was introducing ideas like, if this spirit is manifesting itself in front of you, why would it manifest itself maybe when it's 80 years old? Like we're seeing the ghost of a young William. Maybe that's how it chooses to manifest itself. Maybe that's when it, maybe the lady didn't die in her 20s. So if we're looking down history for somebody young that died in the house, well, maybe it was somebody that moved away years later and just is visiting places that were important to it.
Absolutely.
Ghosts could be transient. We don't know.
Yeah. And that kind of thinking about the paranormal is kind of at the heart of when you hear a story. If you think about that theory that you just brought up of different time periods of a life that a person might reappear in. Yeah, okay, that could explain a lot of things. I think probably the most well-known, or at least worldwide, Lincoln ghost story is the C.C. White building. And it all began, this old building that no longer exists. They tore it down some years ago on the Nebraska Wesleyan campus. And in that building, there was a woman who was a assistant to a professor, and the professor needed something from this other room, so she went to get it, and she opens the door, and here's a woman dressed in clothes from 100 years earlier at a file cabinet doing something. The current woman kind of freaks out, goes back, gets her boss. They both go in there, and there's a musty smell. And the story was picked up by the Lincoln papers, and because the woman swore up and down, and she very kind of valid story. Anyway, that building, first of all, it relates to what you were just saying. Perhaps this is a woman who is appearing as a 40-year-old when she worked at Wesleyan back in the 1890s, and maybe she didn't die until the 1940s, who knows. But that building got demolished, and that story, though, still kind of lingers around. And some years ago now, I went to Wesleyan to just be at the spot where the building used to stand and kind of look at, and there was this little kid and a mother sitting on a park bench, and I started chatting with them. And the woman says, I forget the kid's name, we'll call him Bill. Billy keeps saying he sees something in that field. And I hadn't talked about ghosts with her. I hadn't talked about the C.C. White building with her. I hadn't talked about anything. So I go, oh, Billy, what do you see? So I see a woman over there. Oh, okay. And who knows?
Now, didn't the witness also like she could see past the lady, and didn't the through the window, didn't it look like the old I don't want to say pioneer days.
Yeah, she claims that where there would have been this story happened. I'm going to have to guess because I can't quite remember the date. I think it was the early 1960s. But she'd walked in this room, and now in 1960, there's streets and buildings and so forth out the window. Out the window of the room was nothing but prairie. So it was a flashback in time, if you will, or a view from another time on the earth. And who's to say that's not possible?
Yeah, that's why when I hear these stories and you hear a description of the specter, and you say, well, it was a little boy or like a little girl. Well, back in the early 1900s, I have pictures of my dad who was born in 1904. Yeah, he was 70 when I was born. I drop that little nugget a lot on people because it freaks them out. but
so he decided to have his own grandchildren.
Yeah, I don't think my dad decided to have.
Oh, okay.
It just happened, man. So, but when you see people like they're like, oh, there's a little girl. Well, little boys used to wear their hair sometimes ringleted, and so you don't know, or you could see the ghost of an old woman. Well, maybe it was a ghost of a guy that used to wear women's clothing. If we're gonna be open to any kind of strangeness out there in the world, you have to entertain these ideas of going down these different rabbit holes and everything. So
yeah,
pretty crazy.
Yeah.
So these are like the cream of the crop stories that were submitted for these books that you think?
Absolutely. Yep.
Anything in there that you didn't put in there for other reasons? Like you thought, well, this is, I don't know. Like maybe you didn't want to write about a murder or too tragic of an event or.
And so I would leave it out.
Yeah.
I can't recall that there is such a story that I would leave out for those reasons. In fact, maybe it's my human nature that I'm somewhat drawn to tragedy. So some of the stories have a background to them that I know about that I haven't written about. One story in there, I researched the location, and it turns out that a young man was killed in a traffic accident at that spot some years earlier. I didn't put that in there because I didn't want to, it was too tragic in a way. So I just left that. Sometimes I'll leave those details out, the most tragic ones.
Yeah. And when we're talking about people dying and tragic situations like that, especially if it was too new of an event, when people are still grieving and mourning a loss.
Absolutely.
Many of the stories in here are later on. Another one that got to me was there was the face of the baby that was in the wall, and then there was the sighting of the man. It's kind of like my friend Andrew's story. There was the sighting of the man in the basement, and the witness went and called the police. The police came and checked it out, and then he hears later from a neighbor, well, this has happened a lot of times. Other people that have lived there before you have called the police because they are always seeing some strange guy in the basement.
And you can see why I was attracted to that story because of that detail. It gives you more pause when it's corroborated that way with other witnesses. Yeah. Earlier we were talking about local histories, and I won't tell you what town this is from, but I read a local history very recently, and here's the story. This was 100 plus years ago in the late 1800s, and a 13-year-old young woman was sent by her father from their farm over to this other farm for some kind of errand. She gets to the other farm, and she gets there, and she's 13 or 14, and she says to the farmer, I was coming through this one place on the creek, and I heard this beautiful music. I really did. It was coming from somewhere, but it was so beautiful, and it was music out there in the prairies. Okay, fine. And she did whatever she had to do, and she turned around and go back home. Never got home. They looked all over for her, and they found her at the exact spot she had described hearing the music. No trace. They couldn't figure out how she died. There were no wounds or anything on her body. She's 14, so she didn't die of a heart attack, but at the very same spot that she had described to the farmer where she had heard the music. Now, is that a ghost story? I don't know, but it certainly is a fascinating story. And again, for people interested in this kind of stuff, local histories, read those. I found a wonderful ghost story in the Works Progress Administration, a program that was done in the 1930s where writers were writing different guidebooks and so forth. I found a great Lincoln ghost story in one of those. So they're all over the place.
There's a saying that's attributed to the artist Bansky, and he says that you actually die twice. And the first time is your bodily death. And the second time that you die is when your name is spoken for the last time by somebody. So the fact that you are going through these histories and through these stories. It's like you're continuing on the lives of these people and the stories and the history of Lincoln and letting them live on. So having you on the program, like I said, this was a formative book. I mean, the reason I am still interested in the paranormal and I contact people to be on my program and talk to them about the persistence of like life after death. It's such an important question, but also in the background, there's all this wonderful investigation and history and the telling of these stories and giving voice to those that have lost their voice. And having you, who wrote this this book that was so formative to me. It's been just such an honor and a treat to have you on the program. I'm just so excited that you were.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for inviting me. And I hear from people all the time that talk about that book. As I said, my tombstone, he wrote that ghost book.
Yeah. And don't take this the wrong way, but I pulled out the book again. I was just kind of thumbing through it a couple months ago when I first contacted you, and I'm like, geez, Alan, is he still alive? Is this guy still around?
Right.
So, because I didn't know your history. I didn't know that you went on to teach in Vermont and all that. So I'm like, I have to look him up. I have to talk to this guy and I have to tell him what a great book it is. And when I have listeners all over the world, 90% of them are in the United States. But what's great about this book is that these stories aren't just for Lincoln, Nebraska people. They're not just for Nebraska people. They're not just for Midwest people. They're for everybody, because you can read these stories and you could be taken back to a time in our nation's history. And it mirrors what's going on or what's happened in your town, wherever you're at. Like you said, read the local histories, read these stories that people have jotted down and they might be forgotten. You got to uncover all these old truths. Because, if we're ever going to figure out the riddle of all this, which we won't, but if we're going to figure out these riddles, we need to go back and read the history on all these stories that are still alive today.
I agree. Very well said.
Well, Alan, thanks so much for being a part of the program. If you'll hold the line just a minute, I'll talk to you a little bit more. But I just want to thank you for being on this episode of the Necronomicast.
Thank you, Brian.
There he is, Alan Boye. What a treat to talk to Alan. I've enjoyed his book, The Guide to the Ghost of Lincoln, ever since I was a little boy. And to have him on the show, what a treat. Love it. Next up, Mr. Tayden Bundy and his book, Beyond Lincoln, A History of Nebraska Hauntings. Prepare to be convinced that some Nebraska hauntings are real. And now joining us on the Necronomicast hotline from the haunted Heartland right down the road from the studio, Tayden Bundy, author of Beyond Lincoln. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm really good. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. The listeners just heard a conversation with Alan Boye. And Alan wrote the great book, Ghosts of Lincoln, years ago, and he's a retired professor. And so now I've got this guy pretty much fresh out of college writing his first book, Beyond Lincoln, and it's a great read. I'm so excited to have you part of the Necronomicast on my October local programming.
Right, yeah. Thank you so much for having me on here.
How do you come about writing this ghost book? Because it's for your first book, too. I mean, it's chock full of information, and I'm very impressed with a young writer, first book out. And it's a page turner. It's so fantastic. Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, first off, thank you so much for that. I have loved ghost stories since I was a kid. And I started really thinking about, what that meant for the historical aspects of where they came from. When I was younger, actually, had Dwayne Hutchinson actually came and spoke at my middle school, and he told the story of the C.C. White building. And he was really good about really investigating ghost stories, sort of getting in the middle of them and finding out what they were. And he actually would pick little pieces of history to share in his books as well. And I just started really thinking about that in terms of like the C.C. White building ghost for sure. which is not in my book. He did that, so I sort of left that one alone. But I was thinking a lot about what that meant, because Clara Mills was an actual person. They connected that to history. So I really started thinking about what that meant for other ghost stories. So I started really getting into them. I actually started it as an independent studies project at UNL and just kind of ran with it. So I wanted to find out where these ghost stories came from and if I could figure out the origins of them. So, that's where it all sort of began. I was just very curious.
Sure. And what I appreciate about your book, it's so well researched. I read it twice, and there's 20 pages of the bibliography. I mean, you poured over through archives of the Lincoln Journal-Star, which is the paper in Lincoln, Nebraska, and you really took these famous kind of ghost stories that we grew up with. When I was talking to Alan, I was telling him about when I was a kid and I'm from Omaha, and we'd go to Lincoln for Husker football games, and inevitably we stopped by the university bookstore and would see his iconic yellow cover. And so a guy from Omaha, a little kid, it was really exciting to read about, like you said, the C.C. White Building ghost, or the ghosts of the different residence halls in Lincoln, the state capitol, Bloody Mary, all these great stories that we kind of grew up with. And you've kind of done the same, and you've gone through and did painstaking research. I was really impressed with you really went through the ghost stories and not broke them down to debunk them, but gave historical light behind them. How important was it for you to kind of go into the history rather than the folklore?
Sure. It was interesting to really just dive into them, because like you said, I took the guide to the Ghost of Lincoln around with me as a teenager and found these spots in town and was trying to just experience those on my own. So just really getting into the history of them, I think only gave them more depth and gave them more richness, because then you're realizing that the things that you're telling are actually, they're based off of history in some way, and whether they were sort of distorted over time and turned into ghost stories, or if there's a lot of truth behind them, just really getting into the history allowed me to really understand a lot about the towns in Nebraska and other parts of Lincoln. And you're really diving into some true crime type stuff when you're dealing with ghost stories, a lot of tragedy and things like that. But it allowed me to really see ghost stories from a different way, and I think that it actually just it made me love them more, because I was putting a face almost to the oral history that we pass down, because that's what ghost stories do. They continue on because we share them, and that's why they're important.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm really glad to have you say that on the show, because that's one thing that I talk about ad nauseum on my show, especially when I'm talking to quote unquote paranormal experts, is that these ghost stories, if there's no such thing as ghosts, if there's no such thing as monsters or any of these local legends or stories, if there's no such thing as the phenomenon out there, these stories are still very vastly important, and they're rich because they are our stories. They're our history. And yes, facts or details can ebb and flow through time. But what a great documentation that you've put together of the historical combination with the folklore, putting it all together in such an interesting read. Do you go on many investigations now? Are you more of an investigator in Love Library or?
No, no. I mean, yes, I do love to read and really dive into things historically and see what I can find out that way. But I call myself a quote freelance paranormal researcher. I sort of hop around to different groups, but I've been to a few places in Iowa. Nebraska is not really notorious for doing overnights or really being super open. It seems like when we're talking about haunted locations or paranormal activity in locations, you can kind of get people talking sometimes, but a lot of times I feel like they don't really want that associated with their buildings per se. But Iowa is really great. I've been to a few places there and done some research at Villisca and Malvern Manor and Edinburgh Manor. And actually over the 2 weekends ago, I was in Council Bluffs and was just hitting a bunch of locations in one day with my girlfriend. And we were just kind of, going around to different spots like Squirrel Cage Jail and Dodge House and the Black angel statue at the cemetery in Fairview Cemetery. So, we're just hitting spots, but I don't feel like it in terms of like the paranormal field, when you're talking about like doing investigations or research, it's almost like we're all kind of amateurs and we're experimenting and it's scientific, but I'm a minimalist. I go in with just like generally just a recorder and I love to take photos. But I'm there for the experience more so than anything else. But so I do it. I've dipped my toes in it for sure. And I still do. I work a lot with a gentleman named Jason who has Heartland Paranormal and we just kind of skip around and do a little bit of research there, here and there with locations. But I love the experience of, and the history, these places, they stay alive because they're providing overnights and they're doing museums and they're doing tours. And so then you get to learn about this rich history related to these ghost stories that are associated with this building, and it's keeping that building alive and it's keeping that history there for us to walk into and see, still. So I feel like, the paranormal is a great way to share that history and those experiences. And they have a really great link to each other, history and the paranormal and ghost stories. So, all that stuff, those people were alive once those places had people in them. And so, and they still do, so it's sharing those things through my book or, in any way that I can. I think that that's important to preserve those places.
Oh, sure. And when I've been to Villisca a number of times, and from the very first time I stepped in there, even if it wasn't haunted, it probably is. but I bet $1 it is haunted. But even if it wasn't, what a privilege it is to walk into this place. It's almost like a living museum because you get to walk in and, usually you go into a museum and you look at something and you read a little card and you're like, oh, okay. And then you go to the next exhibit, but you get to actually walk into this farmhouse where these horrific crimes happened. And you get to go into the bedroom and you see the old axe marks still on the wall from when the killer swung the axe back. And you see what it's like to live in this small, cramped little house, and 8 people died there. And it's a museum alive that you can go into and spend the night and sleep in one of the beds if you're so inclined, if you can fall asleep in the Villisca Axe Murder House. And Malvern Manor, the great history of that being the cottage hotel forever. It's different reincarnations as different homes for people that needed help and their stories. People like Josh Hurd have gone through and documented all the deaths and people that have been there and stayed there. And it's just fascinating that these places are, well, they're around, but that you can actually go and be part of the story, I guess you could say, especially with like Villisca, be part of the story, sitting in the attic where the axe murder probably hid until everybody fell asleep. It's endlessly fascinating. And these paranormal experiences, I say it time and time again, they're intimate experiences and they're personal experiences. And so when you say you're not much of a techie or you're not taking a bunch of stuff in there, well, you're taking camera to record and recording maybe some EVPs, but the experience is what we go for. I mean, am I right?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, and in those locations, it's like, it's especially Malvern for sure. I had some weird stuff happen to me there that, I generally go in and I don't generally feel much. And so I just maybe like a sense of heaviness, like Villisca, I definitely felt a sense of heaviness. That's a very heavy place when it comes emotionally. You're walking in and if you know what happened there, it feels heavy. And so in Malvern, I kind of went in, what I like to call blind, where I didn't really do any research. I didn't really do anything beforehand. But I just felt like, I don't know, it was an odd feeling walking in, and I just generally don't feel anything. So I was like, oh, it's going to be, I don't know. We'll see about this night. But that was actually the first and only place that I've ever heard a voice was at Malvern. And I was the only one that heard it. Wasn't on any recordings, nothing like that, but it was my own personal experience. And it was something that I carry with me. And it was just so great for me to experience that. And it was a personal thing for me. And it was like, whoa, like it was just so crazy for me. And I just thought I'm possibly just like listening to to someone who's not around anymore. And I got to hear that. And so, yeah, it's just like what you said with preserving the history of those places and the things that happen there. But yeah, the personal experiences from investigating and just being in those locations and learning about them is what I really enjoy.
Yeah. When I think about, going to these places and these experiences, like Villisca can weigh heavily on you, like you said, and it's the sense of what happened to the victims there, but also like what happens to the community when things like that happen. And even 100 and some odd years later, people still talk about it and people still think about it and write about it. It still lives on. That one night in 1912 still lives on. It's insane. It's crazy. And speaking of insane and crazy, do any of your friends think you're insane or crazy for going out?
No, I think they probably called me the ghost guy or the weird one. I definitely am into the odd and the strange. But it's funny when you start talking about that stuff and then the other people who are really into it too. So they start coming out of the woodwork and then.
Isn't that the truth? Isn't that the truth?
Right.
Like I'll sit there and talk to somebody and I'm like, all right, I'm going to be the weird guy at the party. I'm going to be the weird guy that brings this kind of stuff up. Or inevitably the conversation comes to me like, well, Brian believes in that stuff. And whenever I meet somebody new and we kind of start talking about this stuff, the shared experience of there was that one weird time for me too, when I was at grandma's house, or, I think these paranormal experiences are much more prevalent. They're much more common than we talk about or that we share and experience. It's almost like there's still that little bit of a taboo of, well, I don't want people to think I'm totally nuts,
Right. But I think when people start the conversation or you almost feel like you're in sort of a safe zone with someone, then people will really start telling you the things that happened to them because they realize that you're not going to judge them. That's what they're most afraid of, right? That you're going to think like, oh, I'm crazy. But then, when someone's walking in, that's like, no, I sit in the dark and talk to air for hours trying to get somebody to talk to me. They're like, okay, I can tell you this story. I'll tell you about this thing that happened to me. No, I think that it opens up the door for people. And I think that people want to talk about it. A lot of times they want to share their experiences, but they feel like, this is odd. I don't know if this is something that actually happened to me or if I'm just seeing things or whatever. But I think it's good though to get people talking and get people going and allow them that space to be able to share their experiences and that could potentially create a new ghost story that could be passed on to someone else.
Yeah, right. Kind of a personal question. You mentioned your girlfriend a little bit ago. When you're in a relationship with somebody, did she know about your fascination with the paranormal before or after you guys started dating?
We kind of talked about it early on, actually. Yeah. And it was fun because we kind of have this running joke about how we started talking about cannibals that were living in the woods in like wooded national parks, and they have been like hiding it because there was like some TV shows that were talking about like missing kids, but then they were also talking about adults going missing in the woods.
Keep talking. Keep talking.
So then we kept going into like other sort of odd things. And yep, that's exactly the kids going missing in the woods and stuff. And we started talking about, cannibals in the woods and greatest fears. But then that sort of led into the paranormal and just our love of horror movies. And so we realized that we both actually had a very common love for, a little bit of the odd. So, and she goes along with me on these trips, and it's really fun because we just get to experience it. But we both really love the history as well. So we get to experience it on different levels. And yeah, it was nice to find someone who really likes that as well.
Oh, my wife's a saint, Tayden. My wife is a saint. When we started dating, like, I listened to a lot of, like when we go to parties and stuff in Lincoln, because we both went to UNL, University of Nebraska, Lincoln, for you international listeners, home of the Cornhuskers. But we go to parties and stuff, and then I'd always turn on the dial to KFAB because they had Art Bell late at night. So the paranormal radio show that went overnight for years and years and years. I think it's Coast to Coast is hosted by George Norrie now. But so she's like, oh, okay. So we're going to listen to Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, ghosts, conspiracy theories, all that kind of stuff. So I'm so lucky that she decided to stick with me and accepted my proposal for marriage when I'm like, oh, hey, I was reading about this Bigfoot sighting. Don't want to hear it. Don't want to hear it. So do any other kind of phenomenon trip your trigger? I mean, do you read much about Sasquatch? I mean, you mentioned the 411. We can talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah.
But do you ever think about looking up at the night sky at the blackness of space and thinking about aliens? Or are you into cryptids or anything like that interest you?
I'm not. I mean, it's not that I don't necessarily believe in any of it. It's just ghosts are my go-to. So that's just where my. I mean, we could talk about that stuff. I don't know much about it. So but so I mean, if you're, it's I've looked into it a bit. But yeah, I don't really. My main focus is on the paranormal and ghosts. So that's where, and I'm definitely not an expert, but
sure. Well, who is? There's people that are well read. Like I have a pet peeve. Like I'm not a paranormal expert. I read a lot, but who knows? That's the thing.
Right.
What's neat for me now, how old are you, if I can ask?
I'm 35 actually.
Oh, okay. You're a little bit older than I thought, but I'm 40, I'm 46. So a little bit older than you. And the older I get and the more that I read and the more that I do research and talk to interesting people about all these crazy things, is that I think that more and more I see connections between these things. Like I was reading things about poltergeist experiences, for example, and you go through the classic rundown of a poltergeist experience. Well, a lot of those things are shared by alien encounters or abductions or things like that. Or people in the forest, they see a creature out there. But sometimes before they see the creature, there's lights in the sky. So sometimes there's like some crossover. So I think all these things are kind of connected in a lot of ways. And I read a lot of crazy stuff, but it's super fun. And it's so neat to me to see that in this weird, wonderful world, there's so much mystery out there. And that's what appeals to me, is a lot of the mystery of the paranormal and not knowing and never knowing what is going on until I guess the very end, Right.
Yeah. And what's interesting about those links is that I was doing some research just looking into ghost stories from the past, in like local newspapers and things like that from Nebraska. And there was I saw a pattern in a lot of ghost stories from early on. Like I'm thinking probably like 1880s ish or 1850s ish to about 1910. I don't know, somewhere around there, that range. And they talked about fireballs a lot, ghost fireballs. They would see fireballs, either like a fireball would land in a yard and then they would see like an apparition, or they would see glowing like fire within the apparition or ghost, like it could be like in a field and they would all of a sudden see like fireball eyes or fireballs in their mouth, or, there's just fire associated with that. So it's just interesting that you're talking about other links to things that are, now you don't really hear about that as much. I feel like, and I don't know, in terms of your research, if you've ever come across that, but it was a thing that I noticed enough that I was like, this is interesting that this fireball phenomenon keeps happening over and over again. And people are associating this directly with the paranormal, with ghosts, specifically with like apparitions or spirits. And they're seeing these fireballs.
That's vastly interesting. I love things like that and how they seem to be connected, but we don't necessarily know how.
Right.
Yeah. Isn't that just the mystery of life? Isn't that exciting?
Right. And it's interesting that it was just so coming up so frequently in the past. And now you just don't really hear about that now when it comes to people speaking of apparitions and things like that. So it's just it was a neat thing just to see. And it could have just been, people were associating balls of light at that time period. It could be something scientific that was happening around that time period that could explain that. But it was just interesting that it came up so often that I was like, I'm going to start looking for fireballs and ghosts in the papers and try to see what I can find.
Sure. Like I was reading some, and I want to talk a lot about your book, not to talk about other books too, but I was reading some research about early supposed Bigfoot or cryptid sightings in Pennsylvania. And the words that they used in the early 1900s before we kind of had the pop culture term Bigfoot or even Sasquatch, just stories of wild man in like real newspapers, the New York Times. I mean, now we're not talking the National Enquirer or the Weekly World News or anything like that, but these stories that keep popping up of wild man or hairy man, or Native Americans called these people like brother tribe. Like these things pop up in turn of the century newspapers, old newspapers, news accounts when they had no other words to describe them. And so it's kind of neat to go back with our history, with our research, and go back and read like, well, what was going on back in 1901? What was going on in 1875 in Pennsylvania? Well, it might be connected to what's going on in 1975 or 2021. Your book. All right, let's get to it. You said you started as an undergraduate project at UNL. Is that right?
Yeah. I had the opportunity to do an independent study course. So I was like, please bear with me on this. I have an idea. And my professor was great. She was like, all right, I am going to just trust you with this. And I just essentially started it there. I was sort of experimenting with it, seeing what I wanted to do. And I knew that I wanted to do something a bit different that I hadn't really seen in regards to ghost stories around here for sure. And just, I wanted to do something different. And I was actually a history minor. So I got my degree in English, but I was in history as well. So I was like, I want to see how I can connect the two things that I love together with what I'm studying. So I sort of pitched the idea to her and I was like, I can give you a few chapters, if that is, something that you would be interested in. She was like, yeah, let's do this. So I ended up starting it there and then continued it on after I graduated. So she gave me the opportunity to work on it while I was still in college. And I ended up expanding on it and then, adding several more chapters before I published it. So it started there.
That's great. It's a great read. So when you're going through these stories, did you ever throw any of them in the trash? Or, I mean, like I'm looking at let me look at the table of contents here. So you got at least a dozen stories here. I mean, did you go through some and you're like, I'm going to take those out? And I mean, how long did it take you to put all this together?
I don't know, a little over a year. Mm-hmm. I think that the only ones that there were some stories, which I'm sure that you've probably heard of some of them, like Lake Street Lake is one of them from Lincoln that I wanted so badly to be in this book because it was one of my favorites growing up. But I could not find historical links to that. Wow. If anyone would love to share that with me and I can run with that, yes, I would love to do another book or an extended version of this. But that was one that I was like, I researched for days, just trying to find any tiny tidbit of that. And I thought I was going to get something because it's very specific in that story, because that's what I would do is I would take the ghost stories, really pick them apart and try to find the elements that I could run with and try to find information. I mean, that was about a dairy farm on a specific place in Lincoln, in a very specific location. And so I was like, I'm going to be able to find this. And I couldn't find anything. And and there potentially could be stuff out there that I just didn't find, but that was when I was super bummed that I did not get to do, because I just really liked that story growing up. There was a story about a house here in town called Hobbitsville that I also wanted to do.
Have you ever been to Hobbitsville?
I have not. I mean, I've been there. I've been outside of it. Mm-hmm. I actually ended up contacting the people that live there, and I was like, "Hey, I'm, thinking about writing this book. How would you feel about me talking about your house?" And they were like, we really, appreciate you asking us, but we're, not really interested in people coming around our house, So I was like, cool, I will totally respect that. But it's also been, I don't know when the last time you saw it. if you've seen it recently.
No.
But the people that live in it now clean that entire yard up. So before, when it was still owned by the Abel family, that was super overrun. Mm-hmm. And it was just like covered around. I mean, I don't really know what it looked like on the inside because I wasn't one of those kids that snuck in there, you know.
I was.
but I mean, so it was really like sort of covered up all the way around that fence, so you couldn't really see inside unless you really peeked through or jumped in. But now it's cleaned up. You can see all the way through that yard. So the mystery is gone.
Sure. Now it was partly drunken shenanigans on our part, but a friend of mine who actually does the music to the end of the show, Andrew Vogt, he was a guest on the program too, and I'll get to his episode in just a second. But Andrew was from Lincoln, lives in Colorado now. What's up, Andrew? He one night told me about this Hobbitsville, and there's the story. You know, I'll kind of just go through it. There you go in the yard, and then there's the light, the moonlight shines down, and you can see the tree where somebody supposedly hung himself. But it's hard to describe for people that have not ever heard of this, but it's a constructed, not play set, but it's like a miniature home city. I mean, it's the weirdest thing. It's these structures, these series of structures. And please jump in if you can describe it better than me. I had a couple beers in me every time I went over there, but you'd have to go and jump over this large, scale this wall to get into their backyard. And then we were very respectful as we could be, being trespassers. And I think the statute of limitations is clearly long since passed. But we would wander around these strange structures that were not made of wood. Maybe they were. I mean, it was just the weirdest thing. You wander through this immense series of structures in this backyard. And then there's the story about possibly somebody hung himself, or, it's a good ghost story. But yeah, Hobbitsville, just the strangest thing. And I think I went there once, definitely twice, maybe 3 times, can't remember. But yeah, that was the thing. Jump over the fence and go to Hobbitsville. We never caused any damage, and we didn't leave beer cans or anything like that. But yeah, not my finest hour of investigating the paranormal whatsoever. I'm much more respectful now. And plus I'm in my 40s. I'm not climbing that wall. No way.
Well, you can peek through it now. So
I might have to do that. I might have to, or who knows, maybe you and I'll go over there some night and jump over the wall.
Yeah. I'm going to just probably knock on the door. They'd probably be like, sure, you can look at it.
Yeah. Fair enough. I'm so glad you brought that up. That's a great memory that Andrew and I have. Now, I sent you an email link. I don't know if you had a chance to listen to a past episode of mine.
Yeah, I didn't get all the way through the end with the realtors, but I did listen to the beginning about the apartment.
Yeah, the house that he lived in with his college friends. Now that's Andrew once again. And if I never see a ghost, that's fine. But I tell you that I would believe in them because my friend Andrew is entirely truthful, has no reason to spin a yarn. And I've heard that story from other people, like you said, that lived there in that house. And for people that haven't gone back to listen to that episode, Andrew lived in this house in Lincoln. I'll tell you the address off the air. But it's in a part of town that's historic building, beautiful stained glass windows that were described there. But he saw this full-bodied apparition. And his story to me hasn't changed at all since I've met him. That was 25 some odd years ago. That story people don't really know about unless they know somebody that might have lived there. But I think there's just so many of these paranormal events and occurrences that aren't reported, mostly probably because people don't want to be called crazy. But I think all these things happen, and you just got to be open to them, I guess. Maybe you and I sent a letter. I sent a letter and called it's still being rented by a company. I don't know if it's still owned by the same lady that owned the house back then. But I sent in a very polite, professionally written email and letter to whoever manages the company or manages the house now. And I said, have you heard of anything? Would you be interested in talking to me about everything? They wanted nothing to do with me. They wanted nothing to do, about possibly hurting the rental value of the house. But I think nowadays they'd probably get even more money if there was full-bodied apparitions being spotted in the place.
Right.
Yeah, we might have to do a collaboration. I'd love to meet you in person sometime and go over these things with you, because you just did a top-notch job with this book. I got to hand it to you. I just really enjoyed reading it.
Well, thank you. I loved doing it. It was fun. It was fun to and when you're talking about, that story with what happened to him in that apartment, in that house, it's interesting because, those things do happen to people frequently, and you don't hear about them. And the stories that I chose for this book, you're talking about stories that have been passed down a lot, are pretty, known or well known, or at least sort of have been passed around in communities locally, and they sort of have trickled out into the world of the internet, so I mean these are stories that have a lot of them. I originally was going to do all Lincoln stories because that's where I'm from. I've lived here my entire life. And I've heard these stories like with Alan's book and, walking around and seeing these places. And so I wanted to find out, why they stick around and why we keep telling them too. And so when you're talking about like a story where, you're seeing like a full-bodied apparition in a house, like that's so incredibly profound, and it's like an experience that is worth sharing, and people would be like, wow. But a lot of the stories, when I started doing research to the ones that are really popular and that are being passed down a lot, generally there's something very tragic attached to them, or there's something that's of significance historically. So potentially, these are things where people were visiting these locations more, or they were looking into them more, or something like 20th and Washington, where, something very tragic happens where it turns into an unsolved murder. And then people are talking about it, and this was a very prominent family in town whose son was killed. And, so it's like, you're really getting into things where people are talking about them a lot and frequently. And so who knows? Maybe people are frequenting those locations, or maybe they're just turning into ghost stories because people have told them over and over and over again over the years. Mm-hmm. And, because 20th and Washington, that's just a cold spot. It's like, it's just cold in one area of a corner on the street. But that story, people know that story. And it's actually one of my favorite stories now because of the research that I did. Yeah. And so I just, and it has different versions of the story where it has, a young man, and then it also has a young boy. And so there are things that have changed over time, and it's literally just a cold spot. No, people don't say that they see anything there as far as I know. They're just, they just feel colder in one spot, and they think that is related to the paranormal. Yeah. And if it is or not, the history it's important because something actually tragically happened around there. And it was big news for the time, for sure. Oh, so, I mean, it was all over the place.
Sure. And that's what I love about this book, is that you delve into the history and not, like I said earlier, not to debunk, but to give the historical proper context, because a man did lose his life there. I mean, and this happened. I'm looking at your bibliography for the chapter called 20th in Washington, and everything, 1921, all the newspaper accounts, everything that you got in here, 1921. So 100 years ago, it's still talked about. People are, like I said before, if there are no such things as ghosts, we're still sharing these stories about a man losing his life, and they never caught who did it. 100 years later, we're not any closer to figuring out what happened or why, mistaken identity or whatever reason, who knows? So to delve into these things with a deft touch like you do, I was really impressed with it. And I wanted to have you on the program, and I thought it would be fun to have you on kind of as part of a local show, and have Alan's book on there too, because that was very profound to me as a little kid. And now, years later, a young man such as yourself puts a book together that's just equally as good and just as fascinating, and it's going to be just as important for future generations to go back and refer to. Do you have plans to write part 2 or anything else? Or, you got more than one book in you, right?
Right. I do. I've been sitting on 10 new locations for a while. I definitely, I have 10 new locations that I really want to do. I've done some research on each one of them to see what I could potentially work with. I like to pick places that people can either visit on their own, or they are either accessible, or, they're not personal properties. I don't want to be like, hey, you can just go to this, house down on 27th and Randolph and just hang out there if you want. No, I just, I don't want people just like knocking on someone's door, be like, hey, right. I saw you in this book. I heard about the ghosts here. Can we check them out? Or, I don't really want to, push any trespassing, but I want people to experience these things too, or at least be able to see these places firsthand. And if they still exist, some of them don't exist anymore, but some of the buildings or places, but yes, I'm sitting on 10 right now. I write fiction as well. So I kind of go back and forth in between the two. So it's kind of sitting on the side. I would like to do another book at some point. And I'm honestly, since publishing this one, I've come across more information from these stories that I would love to extend on at some point, expand on at some point, or possibly add them into, with the other 10 and just make something much larger, and just have them all together. But yeah, I mean, it's fun when it's fun when you find new stuff later, but then you're like, darn it, I wish I would have gotten it in there the first time. I feel like I'm keeping a secret from all of you who have read it. But it's also just like neat to find more information and to hear new things. And, as I tried to do everything. I mean, I read, I'm sure, thousands of newspaper articles. I mean, I'm sure that I read thousands of them. And I read several books related to, some of the things that were associated with some of these locations and the people associated with them. And so it's, it was a lot of reading. And it's a lot of like filtering newspaper articles from like even 1921, even with with Barstow, his murderer, and the further back you get, it's harder and harder to distinguish what's going on. So it's almost like you have to really go through hundreds of them, because they will reprint them in other papers, and they change names and they change dates and they change things, because they're relaying information much different than how we tell each other information now. So they're, and they, maybe they're just hearing it and they're writing it down and they're spelling the name how they think it's spelled, or, they're hearing a different date. So it was a lot of just going through and making sure that I was finding consistencies, and I would mainly go with the ones that were the most consistent, because I would think, okay, if this is the one that's being said the most, then this is most likely what the date or the name is referring to. But sometimes it gets sort of funky when you're trying to go through all those articles.
Sure. And that kind of lends itself to the history and the era that they're written in, and these occurrences happened. It's all part of the story, the reporting of it, the underreporting, the over-reporting, the differences in the reporting. Just that's all part of the story and part of the appeal, I think, of these stories too. Just like what it was like to be there in that time, and people talked differently and wrote differently, and so you have to kind of decipher a lot of that too. Just
definitely,
just the English at the time, how people wrote, and it's a super interesting, collection of stories that you put together, and really to have you on the program, what a treat, man. If people want to order a copy of your book, they've loved everything you've said so far, and they're like, yeah, let's listen to some haunted Heartland ghost stories. Where can they find your book?
You can get a copy of my book on my website, taydenbundy.com. Just go to the store page and you can order them one from there, and I'll get one sent to you.
Fantastic. And I've got my copy here. I'm going to leave a little space on my bookcase right over here so I can put the Ghosts or Beyond Lincoln Part 2 next to it. And I'm really looking forward to everything else that you put out, man.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. I mean it though. Let's maybe sometime we can have some kind of investigation or some kind of collaboration, because I find you very interesting, and I really appreciate the way you put this book together. Honest to gosh, sometimes I read some books and I'm like, Okay. But to have one so researched, I really appreciate, I know how hard it is to write. It really is. I mean, it's not as easy as people think it is at all. It's like, oh, I'll just write about this ghost story. Oh yeah. Oh, okay. Great. Okay. No, but you really, you did the work, man. And it shows on every page. And to have you on the Necronomicast, what a treat, man. And I'll make sure to link to your website from ours. And so we can get that information out to the people.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Yeah. And I mean, Omaha, I would have loved to add some more Omaha stories to this book, but I could not get a hold of their archives for their newspapers and I just couldn't get enough.
Yeah.
So it was hard for me to do it, but I have some on my list for 2, and I really would love to do some stuff related to Omaha. So, and if you ever want to show me around some spots in Omaha, let me know.
Let's do it, man. Yeah, let's get this collaboration going because I think you're immensely talented and just a good soul, man. It's good to have you on the show. I appreciate it.
Well, I really appreciate it too.
All right. Well, happy Halloween, Tayden.
Happy Halloween.
There we go. A marathon episode for your listening pleasure with Alan Boye and Tayden Bundy. These are 2 great books, fantastic books. And if you live in the haunted heartland in the Midwest, these have to be on your bookshelf. Next up on the Necronomicast, my final episode for the month of October, and it's a doozy. Right before Halloween, the Halloween weekend, the show's going to come out, and it's going to feature the Voodoo Priestess, Bloody Mary, from New Orleans, Louisiana, the famous tour guide, world-renowned personality, and I'm so excited to have her on the program. The saxophone you hear, that's Mr. Andrew Vogt. Andrew lived in the house that we talked about on this show in Lincoln. Love listening to Andrew play. You can visit him at drewsblues.com. There he is. Everybody, I hope you're enjoying the show, the programming for October. It's been really fun bringing it to you. We got one more for October as we wind down 2021. This episode, copyright 2021. All rights reserved. God bless us all. Now go get some sleep.